Welcome to Take Off Your Shoes. My name is Reverend Marie Duquette. I'm an ordained minister in the Lutheran tradition, and I believe that where my story, your story, and God's story meet, there is holy ground. First of all, let me say that I have allergies, and they're kicking out today inconveniently. So if you hear me clear my throat or something, please excuse me and know that I do not have COVID or anything that you can catch. Good morning. It is good to be here. Thank you for inviting us, for including us. This is our first time in your beautiful state of Maine, although we did our research. 2 weeks ago, we started watching Maine Cabin Masters. We have heard of LL Bean. And we have heard of a famous author who lives here who writes scary books. I think his name is Steve. And even though I have lived in the Great Lakes state for much of my life, I can identify the Atlantic Ocean when I see it. We have seen a lighthouse. We have experienced the culinary perfection of your lobster. It's interesting that part of the reason that we did these things was to answer for ourselves this question that Jesus asks in the beginning of today's gospel: who do you say that I am? This weekend has been about discovering who you are, and to those who might be calling us, for them to discover who we are. Jesus' question is one we answer about one another all the time. And yet answering, who do you say that I am, when Jesus asks, feels much more consequential. Maybe because who we say that Jesus is impacts the lens through which we see one another and tell who we are, who someone we know is. Jesus' response when Peter gives the correct answer, "You are the Messiah," is met by an odd response: "Tell no one." What? It reminds me of this scene in an old movie called Pirate Radio. In this scene, a bunch of modern-day pirates of the airwaves are playing a game in which they try to convey a word to the others on their team, but they can't use the word in giving the clues. One guy says to his team, he's trying to convey a word or a person. He says, "Long flowing robes, long flowing hair." Could be Bob. Really nice. Maybe not Bob. Super duper nice guy. Sandals. And finally a teammate says, "You're not talking about Jesus, are you?" And the teammate gets all excited and goes, "Yes, yes, it's Jesus." And another one of the team says, "Why didn't you say Son of God?" Why didn't you say Son of God? The Son of God. This is the one who we follow, no less than the Son of God. Imagine if that's how we always referred to Jesus instead of using the name Jesus. It's no small thing. And part of the reason it's no small thing is that what the Son of God asks his followers is different than what any ordinary human being might ask. In verse 34, the Son of God says, He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." And that's where I want to focus on your feast day. What does it really mean to take up our cross, really? People incorrectly speak of the cross they must bear all the time, right? Greg Allman, a founding member of the Allman Brothers Band, his biography is titled "My Cross to Bear." It refers in no small part to his struggle with alcoholism. In the Lego Batman movie, a computer says to Batman, "You have beautiful abs, sir." And Batman replies, "That's just my cross to bear." I know you guys don't know me, but you can laugh at my jokes. It's hard to laugh in church. Even well-meaning people at times refer to their own burden in life as their cross to bear, whether it's a physical disease, a mental health challenge, a particularly challenging spouse, child, parent. But for Jesus, picking up his cross was something much more sinister, right? We tend to think of the cross as another word for our lifestyles, our burdens, our suffering, and that's not entirely wrong, but the cross was specifically an image for the suffering and punishment inflicted by the Roman Empire on those perceived to be guilty of sedition. Other alternate leaders and their followers had already been crucified at this time, and the disciples would have felt the shiver of fear go up their spine with the phrase, "Take up your cross and follow." They would have been triggered. It's not wrong to now understand the cross as a more universal image, but we need to be careful not to water down the meaning to be that only of personal suffering and fidelity. For the language of the cross to remain potent, we need to keep its challenging reference to living answerable to a different kingdom and a different leader than the place we inhabit in the everyday sense. Taking up your cross is about transformation within you. Paul liked to say, "We die to sin every day," was the way he said it. When I was in seminary, I worked in a church where the pastor said this phrase in every single sermon. The phrase was, "Do you know what baptism means? It means that you are dead, buried, and out of the way." Every sermon. My 9-year-old son and 4-year-old son, who would sit in the balcony, thought this was rich humor, that he would do it in every sermon. And so they came up with a game to play. They would each bring a quarter to church and put it on the thin railing right there. And when the pastor hit, "Do you know what baptism means? It means that you are dead, buried, out of the way," they would try to grab both quarters. And whoever grabbed both got to keep them. But you had to wait, you had to time it to when he said the phrase. I'm sure it was great fun, but I did have to have a conversation with him. Boys, there's no gambling in church, during the sermon, when I'm a student in seminary. Ever. They agreed they wouldn't do this anymore. The very next Sunday, when the pastor said, "Baptism," I hear from the balcony, hands slapping wood, and I look up there just as a lone quarter flew through the air, landed on the brick of the center aisle right about there, went ping, and then began to spin, before finally falling with a somewhat flatter sounding ping. I looked to the balcony at the very moment that big brother wisely ducked. And baby brother, of course, smiled and waved. "Hi, Mom." Picking up our cross as followers of Jesus does mean something about dying to our own desires and rising again to follow Jesus, who may or may not be going where we prefer to go. Picking up our cross is about participating in the transformation of the world by allowing ourselves to be transformed, by participating in living the gospel. It's about love, but it includes the more demanding, inconvenient ways of loving. I mean, we use the word love to describe everything: strong feelings, sex, buttered popcorn, favorite music group, our children, spouse, Lord and Creator of the universe, all those under things we love, right? But when we talk about real love, about the kind that endures, that might be likened to a cross, the one element present in almost every authentic manifestation of real love is suffering. From the ultimate expression of love, greater love hath no man than this, that he would lay down his life for another man, to the simple act of being patient with your misbehaving children. Love implies forbearance and patience in the midst of trouble. The other part of love and about picking up our cross as followers of Jesus is that this cross is not thrust upon us. We have first right of refusal. Jesus says, if any want to be my followers, it's not an imperative. Our decision to follow is our choice. God does not force humans. The love of God requires consent. Jesus follows on the invitation to those who would follow by picking up their cross by saying, those who lose their life will save it. And while we aren't always sure what this means or how it will play out, we believe in the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and the life everlasting, don't we? The truth is people do choose various forms of suffering for the sake of growing love in the world. Enlisted servicemen and women deny themselves as a way of life, so that those who they serve will be able to sleep at night, knowing someone else has the watch. I know a man who retired in his 50s, and he's spending the rest of his life teaching people about native plants and helping churches and businesses and any willing organization better understand the effects of climate change, and then showing them how they can take small steps on the land that they own to plant native plants to help with the negative effects of climate change. How they can do this care for creation and make up some of the damage humanity has done over the years. It isn't exactly a lifestyle we would equate with suffering, but he's committed to it. It's a commitment to love the earth and the people in it by doing it day after day after day. I see him on his knees in the dirt around town. And you, faithful people of God, you who have come through your own traumas, including most recently a worldwide pandemic, whose long-term effects we are just beginning to name. You know something about this cross that we are invited to carry as members of the body of Christ. You have worshiped when it was uncomfortable, in ways that were awkward, at a time when people were walking away from their churches and their faith in huge numbers. And while in the face of so much death, some wondered, and some actually said aloud this age-old question, where is your God? Not everyone understands that our God is found in places and situations we, along with the rest of the world, would just as soon avoid. Jesus is in effect saying that to be his follower means to venture away from the cool and comfortable Galilees into the more risky, unpredictable, even hazardous regions of life, into the Judean desert, onto the dangerous road that leads to Jerusalem. I believe it was Neil Simon who said, if no one ever took risks, Michelangelo would have painted the Sistine floor. Following Jesus is about taking risks for the sake of love. It's about living in a rhythm of confession, forgiveness, renewed commitment, risk, failure, confession, forgiveness, commitment, risk. It's about doing more than you realized you would be doing when you first chose to practice Christianity. It's about following Jesus into places and situations that those not committed to the cross might just skip. And we're often tempted to follow Jesus up to a point, right? It's easy to follow Jesus here in our beautiful sanctuaries on Sunday mornings. It's somewhat easy to administer programs within the walls of our church. It's like saying, Jesus, I'm only going as far as the southern edge of Galilee. You can let me out there. Jesus is not our Lyft driver. Church, for many of us, has frequently been a comfortable and safe place, like a nest But a church isn't supposed to be about cuddling up in a nest. It's about being pushed out over its edge, learning to fly. One of our Eucharistic prayers reminds us, deliver us from the presumption of coming to this table for solace alone and not for strength, for pardon only and not for renewal. Sometimes we find Galilee to be a circle around a baptismal font. It happens when we treat baptism as a safe little celebration, a day to dress up, have the cake, have the pictures, when in fact, all those years ago, my internship pastor was right. It is a place of dying and rising again. Baptism is about doing that. We rise again into a life of endless connection with flawed humans with whom we travel to Jerusalem. Then Jesus began to teach them that the promised one had to suffer much, be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and religious scholars, be put to death, and rise again 3 days later. What a shock for those disciples who suddenly wondered, is this the same assignment we signed up for? There's a true story about a woman who signed up for a 10K run. When the gun went off, she was caught up in the runners from the starting line, and she ran, and she ran, and she ran, and she ran. And finally, she stopped to ask her official, why isn't the course at this point turning around? He said, you're running the Cleveland Marathon, 26 miles. Her race had started a half hour after the marathon. She was in a wrong race. She made the decision to keep right on going. She finished the race. Later, she told an interviewer, that wasn't the race I trained for, and it wasn't the race I entered, but for better or worse, it's the race I ran. Do you ever feel like that as a member of church? A lot of Christians find halfway into the race that they're going to have to go farther than they thought, in a different direction. Just ask anyone on the property committee. They'll know something about doing more than you signed up for. Jesus never promised that the journey would be comfortable. But he did promise that we would never be alone, and that's one of the mystical experiences of following Jesus. To know the presence of the Holy Spirit in ways we cannot define and we cannot deny. To have other followers walk with us through some of our darkest moments, and to find the depth of beauty in walking with them through theirs. For you here, people from 2 churches who are engaged in seeking a new pastor who will walk with you into the future of a church that is changing in ways we honestly had not imagined when our churches were built, did we? All over this land, churches are closing and merging and choosing to downsize so that money they had previously earmarked to maintain their cathedrals was available for new ministries that Jesus was calling them to do. The future church may well have a less predictable rhythm than we are accustomed to living, but Jesus is doing what Jesus has always done and what God always does, calling people to venture forth into the future in new ways, not knowing where they're going. To dare more boldly, in Maine you might say to sail on wider seas, when in losing sight of the land you find yourselves turning to the lights in the night sky and the wind against your back to guide the movement going forward. Do not be daunted. Do not be intimidated in this venture of calling a new pastor and finding your way forward just because today you cannot see where it leads. Remember that none of us carries our cross alone, and that as a committed band of saints and sinners, committed to following Jesus together, we are able to step into each and every tomorrow with a sense of strength and courage and hope. Thank you for listening to Take Off Your Shoes. Let me send you out now with this blessing. May God give you the grace never to sell yourself short, grace to risk something big for something good, and grace to remember the world is now too dangerous for anything but the truth and too small for anything but love.
If you're still listening, she held your attention. Give her a thumbs up and subscribe. Watch the video on her YouTube channel. Search on YouTube for Take Off Your Shoes with Marie Duquette, Duque.